Welcome to part 4 of the VenueMagic Events tutorial, as part of the Secrets of the VenueMagic Masters series of video tutorials. In this video, we'll introduce you to the VenueMagic Event Table and show you how to use it to trigger timelines and other events from an external trigger like a switch or a MIDI message. The Event Table feature is available only in VenueMagic SC Plus edition and above. Also, some of the features we will be discussing require VenueMagic SC Plus version 4.0.
It is assumed that you've already viewed the VenueMagic Getting Started video tutorials.
So far in our discussions of VenueMagic events, we've mostly talked about using events in timelines. We've also covered event conditions and showed you how timeline events can be set up to trigger only if specified conditions are met, like a switch being turned on. But what if we don't want to limit the event to being triggered only at a specific point in time on a timeline? What if we want the event to keep an eye out for certain conditions all of the time and trigger when those conditions are met? That is where the event table comes in.
We'll start with a new project that already has a single timeline in it that flashes some lights. We've also set up the preview window to show those lights.
We can open the event table from the main menu by clicking on Events and selecting Event Table. The events listed in this table are constantly evaluating the specified conditions. When the conditions evaluate as true, the event triggers. Let's start by adding an event to run a timeline when a VCS slider moves above a certain value, say 50%. First click Add, then select an event type. Again, we'll use a run timeline event. Enter a name for the event as it will appear in the event table, or just leave the default and we can change it later. Now select our timeline in the Event tab. We'll select one I created before the tutorial that simply flashes lights with no sound. We'll have plenty of opportunity to make a lot of noise later on. In the Conditions tab, we'll add a condition to watch for VCS slider 1 to go above 50%. By the way, we can set up multiple conditions just like we did in the last video, part 3, and the event will trigger only when all conditions are met. This checkbox is a convenient way to turn condition evaluation on and off, and is usually used to test events in timelines. When unchecked, the event will ignore the condition and trigger all the time. Again, great for testing events in timelines. Not so good in the event table because unchecking it would cause the event to constantly trigger. So we'll leave it checked. The next tab is the Triggering tab, and this is very important. In addition to specifying a trigger condition, we also need to select a trigger mode. The most common trigger mode is the edge trigger mode. In the context of our VCS slider, the edge trigger mode means that after the event has triggered by the slider going above 50%, it must be reset by lowering slider below 50% before the event can trigger again. Let's stick with the edge trigger mode for now and see how this works. Click OK to save the settings, then OK again to close the event table. Now grab VCS slider 1 and move it up. As soon as it passes 50%, the timeline runs. Now let's drop it below 50% and raise it up again. Another timeline runs. We can keep moving the slider up and down all day and it will keep adding timelines to the queue list. Let's stop playback and go back and look at another trigger mode. If we choose the level trigger mode, it will not wait for slider 1 to drop below 50% to reset the event like the edge trigger did. Instead, it will cause the event to fire at every update interval as long as the slider is above 50%. So what do we mean by update interval? The update interval refers to how frequently the event condition is evaluated to determine if the event should be triggered. You can set the update interval here. This number is 0 milliseconds by default, which means that the event condition will be evaluated as fast as possible, usually once every 10 to 30 milliseconds. For sanity's sake, let's change this to 1000 milliseconds or 1 second, and try it out. When I move this slider above 50%, it starts adding timelines to the queue list at a rate of 1 per second. When I move it below 50%, it stops adding timelines. By the way, if we had left the update interval at 0 with the level trigger mode selected, we would have seen this. Not pretty. If we had disabled conditions, this would have gone on forever. If you ever run into a situation like that, the best thing to do is disable the event table, which you can do by clicking on this icon on the top. The event table is always disabled when the event table window is open. However, as soon as you close the window, the event table will start up again unless you first check Disable Events Before Close.
You can re-enable the event table afterwards, either by clicking on the Enable Event icon or from the Events menu by selecting Enable Event Table.
Going back to our trigger modes, the next one in the list is called Manual. In Manual trigger mode, the event will not reset itself once triggered. Instead, it must be reset by another event called the Reset Event Group event. I'll show you how it works.
First, we need to assign this event to a trigger group. The default group of 0 will be fine. Then we'll close the event table.
Go over to the Events folder in the Project window and find the Reset Event Group event. Then drag it over and drop it onto a Q button, or you can drop it here on the border to add a new Q button. We'll do that instead.
Enter the Q button properties and click Setup Event. There are only two settings in this simple event. In this setting, choose the trigger group you want to reset. Our event in the event table was set to trigger group 0, so we'll leave this parameter at 0 as well.
Clicking this Q button will reset all the manual reset events in the event table in group 0. If you want this Q button to reset all events in the table, regardless of its group, check this box here. Notice that when we move the slider up and down, it will only trigger the event once to run our timeline. If we want the slider to run another, we need to reset the event first by clicking the Q button to run the Reset Event Group event. Then move the slider back up again. If you click the button while the slider is already above 50%, it will immediately run another timeline and then wait for another reset.
The final trigger mode we will be discussing for events in the event table is called No Trigger. In this mode, the event is not triggered based on a specified condition. In fact, the only way to trigger the event is by using another event called an event table event, whose sole purpose is to directly trigger other events in the event table. So let's select that mode. The next thing we need to do is make sure our run timeline event has a proper name because the event table event is going to need to know that.
Right-click on our event in the table and select Rename. Enter a name, we'll go with Play My Timeline, and press the Enter key on your keyboard. Now go find the event table event in the Events folder and drag it into the Q button area.
Open the Properties window and click on Setup Event. Select the event in the table that we want this event to trigger.
We'll close out with OK and OK, then click the button. And our timeline runs. Keep in mind that clicking this Q button does not run our timeline directly. Instead, it triggers an event that tells the Play My Timeline event in the event table to play the timeline.
Also keep in mind that the condition we set up for the Play My Timeline event still applies, and that only ran because we happened to leave slider 1 above 50%.
If we move it down below 50% and click the Q button again, you'll notice that it does not run. So why would we need an event that does nothing but run another event in the event table? This all seems pretty complicated, doesn't it? Well, it's actually designed to make things less complicated. Later on, when we talk about multi-event events, we'll learn that it's possible to put together some pretty complicated events with many other events being affected by complex conditions. Suppose that you needed to run that event in several different timelines. Rather than copy the one complicated event into each timeline, just create it once in the event table with its trigger mode set to no trigger, and then trigger it from the different timelines using the event table event. That way, if you need to change how the event works, you only have to do it in one place. Well, that wraps up our discussion of the event table for now. Coming up in part 5 of the VenueMagic Events series, we'll learn about multi-event events and how to use them to play timelines randomly, along with some other cool stuff. Until then, have a great day.